Look at your hand. Move your fingers. Now think about this. That hand, those fingers, the brain sending signals to control them, they're all basically identical to the hands and brains of humans who lived 100,000 years ago. Not similar, identical. Same bone structure, same muscle attachments, same neural wiring. A human from 100,000 years ago could wake up tomorrow, put on a suit, and physically blend right into a crowd in Tokyo or New York or London. Sure, they'd be confused as hell, but their body would be indistinguishable from yours. That's not normal. That's not how evolution works. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe, and definitely tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I read every comment and it's wild. Someone's having breakfast in Stockholm while someone else is trying to sleep in Sydney. All of you, right now, listening to the same story about when humanity almost ended. Here's the thing that should keep you awake, at least for a few more minutes. Every other species on Earth is constantly evolving. Bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics in years. Birds adapt to new environments within generations. Even our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, show measurable genetic changes over thousands of years. But humans, we hit pause. Around 100,000 years ago, our physical evolution essentially stopped. Our bodies froze in place while everything around us kept changing. But here's where it gets really strange. The moment our bodies stopped evolving, something else exploded. Culture, innovation, technology. It's like evolution looked at humans and said, you know what? We're done with the hardware. Let's see what they can do with software updates instead. Think about what that means. The person who invented the wheel had the same brain capacity as the person who invented the internet. The humans who first painted on cave walls had the same creative potential as Michelangelo, as Beethoven, as whoever designed the smartphone you might be holding right now. We didn't get smarter. We didn't evolve bigger brains or faster reflexes or stronger bodies. We just got better at using what we already had. You are essentially a Paleolithic human piloting a meat suit designed for the Ice Age. Your body thinks it's supposed to be hunting mammoths and gathering berries, sleeping when it gets dark, waking when the sun rises, walking 10 to 15 miles a day just to survive. Instead, you're sitting in artificial light, eating processed foods your digestive system barely recognizes, staring at screens that didn't exist even 50 years ago. Your body hasn't caught up. It can't, because evolution stopped. Now you might be thinking, wait, humans didn't stop evolving. We're still here, we're still changing. And you'd be partly right. We've had minor adaptations. Some populations developed lactose tolerance. Others adapted to high altitudes. We've got different skin colors, different builds, different resistance to certain diseases. But these are tiny tweaks, superficial adjustments. The fundamental architecture, the basic model of what it means to be human, that locked in place 100,000 years ago and hasn't budged since. Scientists call this morphological stasis, evolutionary freeze frame. And it's bizarre. Most species don't work this way. Usually evolution is relentless. Environmental pressures constantly push organisms to adapt or die. New predators appear. Climates change. Food sources shift. Species either evolve to keep up or they go extinct. But somehow humans broke the rules. Here's what makes this even more mind-bending. The period when our evolution stopped, around 100,000 years ago, that wasn't some peaceful, stable time when humans could just coast. It was hell. Ice ages were cycling through their most brutal phases. Climate was wildly unstable. Megafauna were going extinct. Early human populations were scattered, isolated, barely hanging on. By all logic, this should have been when evolution accelerated, when natural selection worked over time to help us adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Instead, evolution shrugged and walked away. Our bodies stayed the same, but our minds, our cultures, our technologies, they went supernova. So what happened? What catastrophic event nearly wiped us out and somehow froze our physical evolution while launching our cultural evolution into overdrive? Why are we still walking around in bodies designed for a world that doesn't exist anymore? And the question that might actually keep you awake: if we stopped evolving physically, does that mean we're stuck like this? Are we the final version of humanity, or is something else coming? The answer involves the closest call humanity has ever faced. A moment when there were so few of us left that every person alive today, all 8 billion of us, we're all descended from a group smaller than a typical village. A moment when our species stood at the edge of extinction and somehow, impossibly, survived. But survival came with a price. It changed what we were. It changed what we could become. It locked us into these Ice Age bodies while the world around us transformed beyond recognition. This is the story of the day humans stopped evolving. The day everything changed by staying exactly the same. And it all started 100,000 years ago, when the world was a very different place. Close your eyes and try to imagine Earth 100,000 years ago. Not the planet you know, with its cities and farms and billions of people connected by satellites and fiber optic cables. Imagine a world so empty that you could walk for weeks without seeing another human being. A world so hostile that just surviving another day was an achievement worth celebrating. Because here's the thing about 100,000 years ago. The Earth was in the grip of an age that had been grinding away at the planet for tens of thousands of years. Massive glaciers covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. Ice sheets kilometers thick stretched from the Arctic down to what is now New York and London. The weight of all that ice was so enormous, it literally pressed the continents down, deforming the Earth's crust. But it wasn't the ice itself that made life so difficult for our ancestors. It was everything else the ice caused. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than today because so much water was locked up in glaciers. The Mediterranean was a fraction of its current size. The Persian Gulf didn't exist. You could walk from Southeast Asia to Australia across land bridges that are now deep underwater. The world's geography was fundamentally different, and it was dry, catastrophically dry. When water gets trapped in ice sheets, it can't participate in the water cycle. No evaporation, no clouds, no rain. Across Africa, Asia, and Australia, rainfall dropped to levels that would make modern deserts look lush. Grasslands that had supported massive herds of animals shriveled into bare dust. Forests retreated to tiny pockets near permanent water sources. Rivers that had flowed for millions of years simply stopped, leaving behind dry channels that filled with wind-blown sand. For humans, this created an impossible situation. Our species, Homo sapiens, had evolved in Africa during a wetter, more hospitable period. We were adapted for the savannas and woodlands that covered much of the continent. We hunted grazing animals, gathered plant foods, followed seasonal patterns of rainfall and animal migration. Our entire survival strategy depended on predictable resources and relatively abundant food. Then the world changed. The climate shifts of 100,000 years ago weren't gradual. They were rapid and devastating. Within a few generations, regions that had supported thousands of people became uninhabitable. Water sources dried up. Animal populations crashed. Plant foods disappeared. And humans, lacking the technology to store food long-term or artificially create water, were forced to retreat into smaller and smaller territories. The genetic evidence for what happened next is stark and undeniable. When scientists analyze human DNA, they can estimate historical population sizes by measuring genetic diversity. High diversity means large populations with lots of variation. Low diversity means small populations where everyone is closely related. And when they look at human DNA from around 100,000 years ago, they see something shocking. A collapse so severe it suggests our entire species was reduced to perhaps 10,000 individuals, maybe less. Some estimates put the breeding population at fewer than 2,000 people. Let that sink in. Fewer than 2,000 breeding pairs means probably fewer than 10,000 total humans on the entire planet. For comparison, there are more people living in a single city block in Manhattan than were alive in the entire world at this time. The whole human species could have fit into a modern sports stadium with room to spare. This is what geneticists call a population bottleneck, a period when a species' numbers crash so low that almost all genetic diversity is lost. The individuals who survive the bottleneck become the ancestors of everyone who comes after. Everyone who didn't make it through, all their genetic variants, their unique combinations of genes, gone forever. It's like forcing the entire genetic heritage of humanity through the eye of a needle. How do scientists know this happened? Several lines of evidence all point to the same conclusion. First, human genetic diversity is remarkably low compared to other great apes. Chimpanzees, which number perhaps 300,000 individuals today, have far more genetic variation than humans, even though there are 8 billion of us. That's backwards. Large populations should have more diversity, not less, unless something happened to eliminate most of that diversity in the past. Second, when geneticists trace human mitochondrial DNA, which passes only through the maternal line, they find that all living humans descend from a population that existed around 100,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa. The same pattern shows up in Y chromosome DNA, which passes only through the paternal line. Both genetic lineages show signs of having passed through a severe bottleneck. Third, the human genome contains long stretches of identical DNA that you wouldn't expect to see in a species with a long history of large populations. These homozygous regions suggest that many modern humans are descended from a small group of ancestors who were all closely related to each other. We're all cousins, much more closely than most species. But what caused this near-extinction event? One theory has captured scientific imagination for decades, and it involves the most catastrophic volcanic eruption in human history. Around 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Indonesia exploded with a force that defies comprehension. The eruption was 5,000 times larger than Mount St. Helens. It ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere. The explosion was so violent it created a caldera 100 kilometers long that's still visible today as Lake Toba. The immediate effects were devastating. Ash fall covered India in a layer up to 15 centimeters deep. Volcanic material reached as far as East Africa and the Middle East. The sky went dark across much of the planet as ash blocked the sun, but the real disaster was just beginning. All that volcanic material injected into the stratosphere created a volcanic winter that lasted for years, maybe decades. Temperatures plummeted. The already stressed climate of the Ice Age was pushed into hyper-crisis mode. Volcanic sulfur dioxide formed, clouds of sulfuric acid that reflected sunlight back into space. Global temperatures may have dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius on average, with some regions seeing drops of 10 degrees or more. For human populations already struggling to survive in a harsh Ice Age world, this was apocalyptic. The few remaining grasslands and forests that had supported them collapsed entirely. Even the marginal refuges where people had clustered became uninhabitable. Archaeological sites from this period simply disappear in many regions. Not because people stopped leaving artifacts, but because there were no people left to leave them. But here's where the story gets complicated. The Toba catastrophe theory, while dramatic, is controversial. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that some human populations survived relatively close to the Toba eruption site. Stone tools and other artifacts from before and after the eruption show continuity, rather than complete population collapse in some regions. This has led some scientists to question whether Toba alone could have caused the bottleneck. The alternative theory is more gradual but equally deadly. Maybe it wasn't one catastrophic event, but rather the cumulative effect of millennia of climate instability. The period from 100,000 to 50,000 years ago was characterized by wild climate swings. Temperature and rainfall could change dramatically within a single generation. Resources that were abundant one decade could vanish the next. This created a survival lottery where even successful human groups could be wiped out by random environmental fluctuations they couldn't predict or prepare for. Under these conditions, maintaining large populations became impossible. Groups that grew too large quickly exhausted local resources. Groups that stayed in one place too long found themselves stranded when the climate shifted and made their territory uninhabitable. The only strategy that worked was staying small and mobile. Move when resources declined. Never let your population grow so large that you couldn't relocate quickly if necessary. This created what biologists call a metapopulation structure. Dozens, maybe hundreds of small human groups scattered across Africa, each containing perhaps 20 to 100 individuals. These groups rose and fell, went extinct and were replaced, but the overall network somehow survived. When one group died out from disease or local resource collapse, migrants from neighboring groups eventually repopulated the empty territory. The network persisted even as individual nodes failed. But it was a desperate, precarious existence. Archaeological evidence from this period shows humans pushed into marginal environments that modern hunter-gatherers avoid. Coastal caves where they harvested shellfish, isolated spring sites in otherwise barren deserts, mountain valleys where they hunted whatever animals could survive the extreme conditions. These weren't chosen territories. These were the last refugees available to a species that was running out of places to live, and they weren't alone. This is crucial to understand. 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was just one of several human species competing for the same shrinking resources. Neanderthals controlled much of Europe and Western Asia. They were physically robust, cold-adapted, and had been successfully surviving Ice Age conditions for hundreds of thousands of years. In Asia, the Denisovans occupied territories from Siberia to Southeast Asia, perfectly adapted to their own ecological niches. In Africa itself, other archaic human populations may have persisted in isolated regions. All these different human species were facing the same climate crisis. All were struggling to survive with limited resources, and all were potentially in competition when their territories overlapped. The archaeological record from this period shows evidence of interbreeding between different human species when they encountered each other. Neanderthal DNA in modern human genomes, Denisovan DNA in Asian populations. These are genetic signatures of desperate times when small human groups met at the margins of habitable territories and sometimes chose cooperation over competition. but mostly the evidence suggests isolation. Human groups were so scattered and so small that they rarely encountered each other at all. Generations could pass without a group meeting any other humans. Children could grow up, live entire lives, and die having never seen anyone outside their immediate family group of 20 or 30 people. The human world had shrunk to almost nothing. The stone tools from this period tell their own story. They're functional but not elaborate. Basic cutting implements, scraping tools, simple spear points. Nothing fancy, nothing experimental. This is the technology of survival, not innovation. When you're living on the edge of extinction, you can't afford to experiment with new tool designs that might not work. You stick with what's proven, what's reliable, what won't get you killed. So the stage is set. Earth 100,000 years ago was a planet in crisis. Ice sheets covering the northern continents, deserts expanding across Africa and Asia, rainfall patterns completely disrupted. And scattered across this harsh landscape, fewer than 10,000 humans clinging to survival in isolated pockets. These weren't thriving populations expanding and innovating. These were desperate survivors, living generation to generation, hoping the next drought wouldn't be the one that finally killed them all. This was the world where human evolution hit pause, where the normal processes of genetic change and adaptation slowed to a crawl, where, for reasons we're still trying to fully understand, we essentially stopped evolving in the ways our ancestors had for millions of years before. To understand why, we need to look at what was happening inside those tiny human populations, at the genetic mechanisms that were about to trap humanity in an evolutionary freeze that would last for 100,000 years, because what happened next changed everything about what it means to be human. Here's something that should keep you awake at night but won't, because this is a sleep video. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, carries remarkably similar DNA. Not just similar in the way that all humans are obviously the same species, similar in a way that's actually weird, statistically improbable, and deeply unsettling when you understand what it means. Compare human genetic diversity to chimpanzees. Chimps, our closest living relatives, who number maybe 300,000 in the wild, have 4 times more genetic variation than the entire human species. 4 times, with a population 25,000 times smaller than ours. That's not how populations are supposed to work. More individuals should mean more genetic diversity, not less. But humans break that rule spectacularly. Or look at orangutans. There are only about 100,000 orangutans left in the wild, split between 2 species on different islands. They have more genetic diversity than humans. Gorillas, with populations under 200,000, more diverse than humans. Even some rodent species with tiny fragmented populations show greater genetic variation than we do. This is the signature of something catastrophic in our past, something that reduced human populations so drastically, so suddenly, that the genetic effects are still visible today, hundreds of thousands of years later. Geneticists call this a population bottleneck, and the evidence for it is written in every cell of your body. A population bottleneck happens when a species experiences a dramatic reduction in numbers. Could be a disaster, disease, climate collapse, whatever. Most individuals die. Only a small group survives. When populations rebuild from that tiny surviving group, they carry forward only the genetic variation those survivors possessed. Everything else, all the genetic diversity from the individuals who died, gone forever. Think of it like this. Imagine humanity has a deck of genetic cards, millions of different variants for every trait. hair colour, height, immune system variants, everything. Now imagine someone takes that deck and randomly throws away 99.9% of the cards. Whatever remains becomes the basis for all future populations. That's a bottleneck. And humans went through one that was more severe than almost any other mammal species has experienced and survived. The first hints came in the 1990s when geneticists began analysing mitochondrial DNA from populations around the world. Mitochondrial DNA is special because it passes only through the maternal line, from mother to child, unchanged except for occasional mutations. By comparing mitochondrial DNA between populations, researchers can estimate how long ago different groups shared a common ancestor. What they found was shocking. All modern humans, from every continent, every population, trace their mitochondrial DNA back to a surprisingly recent common ancestor. Somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago, all human mitochondrial lineages converge on a single woman. Not because she was the only woman alive, she wasn't, but because she's the only one whose maternal line survived to the present day. Every other maternal lineage from that period went extinct. Then they analysed Y chromosome DNA, which passes only through the paternal line. Same pattern. All modern humans trace their Y chromosomes back to a single man who lived roughly the same time period. Again, not the only man alive, but the only one whose paternal line survived. This pointed to something dramatic happening in the human population sometime in the last few 100,000 years. But the real bombshell came when researchers began analysing nuclear DNA, the genetic material inherited from both parents. Nuclear DNA gives you a much more complete picture of population history because it's shuffled and recombined every generation. The nuclear DNA studies confirmed it. Humans had gone through an extreme population bottleneck. The genetic evidence suggested that at some point, probably between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, the entire human population crashed to perhaps 10,000 individuals. Some estimates put it even lower, maybe 2,000 to 5,000 breeding adults. To understand how catastrophically small that is, consider this. There are more giant pandas alive today, about 2,000 in the wild, than there were breeding humans during the bottleneck. Giant pandas are considered critically endangered. Our ancestors were, by modern conservation standards, functionally extinct. But what caused it? The leading theory for years was Toba. Around 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in present-day Indonesia produced the largest volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years. We're not talking about a mountain exploding. We're talking about 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash ejected into the atmosphere. For comparison, Mount St. Helens in 1,980 ejected about 1 cubic kilometer. Toba was 2,800 times larger. The eruption would have been visible from space if there had been anyone in space to see it. A column of ash and superheated gas rising 50 kilometers into the stratosphere. Pyroclastic flows, walls of incandescent debris moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour, obliterating everything within hundreds of miles of the volcano. Ash deposits from Toba are found in layers up to 6 meters thick in some parts of India, 3,000 kilometers from the eruption site. But the immediate destruction was nothing compared to what came next. All that ash in the stratosphere blocked sunlight. Global temperatures plummeted. Some estimates suggest average temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius worldwide, even more in some regions. This triggered what volcanologists call a volcanic winter. a period of rapid cooling that disrupted weather patterns and devastated ecosystems. Plants died from lack of sunlight. Herbivores starved without plants. Predators starved without herbivores. The entire food web collapsed. In Africa, where our ancestors were living, the environmental impact would have been catastrophic. Grasslands that had supported large animal herds turned to scrubland and desert. Rivers dried up. Lakes shrank or disappeared entirely. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a dramatic reduction in human occupation sites. Places that had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years were suddenly abandoned. The population crashed, and crashed hard. This is the Toba catastrophe theory. Humans were nearly wiped out by a volcanic supereruption and the climate disaster that followed. It's a compelling story. The timing fits the genetic evidence reasonably well. The scale of the eruption was certainly sufficient to cause a global crisis, and volcanic winters are well-documented phenomena. We know they happen. We know they're devastating. But here's the problem. Recent research has complicated the picture significantly. Ice core data from this period shows temperatures did drop after Toba, but maybe not as dramatically or as long as the theory requires. Some archaeological sites show continuous occupation through the Toba period, suggesting at least some human population survived without major disruption. Genetic studies with better resolution suggest the bottleneck might have started earlier and lasted longer than a single volcanic event could explain. This has led researchers to consider alternative theories. Maybe it wasn't one catastrophic event. Maybe it was a prolonged period of environmental stress. Between 200,000 and 70,000 years ago, Africa experienced severe climate instability. The Sahara expanded and contracted repeatedly. Lakes appeared and disappeared. Rainfall patterns shifted dramatically. For tens of thousands of years, human populations would have been squeezed into shrinking refugees during dry periods, then expanded during wetter periods, only to be squeezed again when the climate shifted. This kind of prolonged environmental pressure could produce a bottleneck just as severe as Toba, but spread out over much longer timescales. Populations would decline gradually as habitats shrank. They'd suffer from increased competition for resources. Disease would spread more easily in crowded refuge populations. Inbreeding would become a problem as groups became more isolated. Another theory focuses on disease. A pandemic sweeping through already stressed human populations could have devastated numbers. We know this happens. The Black Death killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in just a few years. Smallpox devastated Native American populations after European contact. A disease to which humans had no immunity, combined with environmental stress, could easily produce a severe bottleneck. Or maybe it was all of these things. Climate stress weakening populations, then Toba delivering a knockout punch, followed by disease sweeping through the survivors. Nature rarely works with single causes. More likely our ancestors faced a perfect storm of catastrophes that nearly ended the human experiment before it really began. Whatever the cause, the genetic evidence is clear. Human populations crashed and stayed crashed for a long time. Recent studies using advanced genomic analysis suggest the bottleneck lasted not just decades or centuries, but tens of thousands of years. Humans spent somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years, trapped at population levels so low that we were functionally endangered. This prolonged bottleneck had profound evolutionary consequences. When populations get this small, normal evolutionary mechanisms start acting strangely. In large populations, natural selection is the dominant force shaping evolution. beneficial mutations spread, harmful mutations are eliminated, populations adapt to their environment through predictable processes. But in tiny populations, two other evolutionary forces become dominant: genetic drift and the founder effect. Both can override natural selection entirely, producing evolutionary outcomes that have nothing to do with adaptation. Genetic drift is essentially random chance affecting gene frequencies. In a population of millions, if a few individuals happen to die before reproducing, it barely affects the overall genetic makeup. But in a population of 2,000, random deaths can dramatically alter which genes get passed to the next generation. A beneficial mutation might disappear purely by chance if the individuals carrying it happen to die in an accident. A neutral or even slightly harmful mutation might spread throughout the population just because the individuals who carried it happened to survive and reproduce. Over thousands of generations in bottleneck conditions, genetic drift can reshape a species in ways that have nothing to do with survival advantage. Traits might be lost not because they were harmful, but because they were carried by unlucky individuals. Other traits might become universal, not because they're beneficial, but because they happened to be present in the surviving population. The founder effect is related but distinct. When a small group colonizes new territory or survives a population crash, they carry only a subset of the genetic variation from the original population. Whatever genes they happen to possess become the foundation for all future populations in that region, even if those genes are rare variants that were uncommon in the original population. They might become standard in the new population simply because the founders carried them. During the human bottleneck, both processes would have been operating at full force. Small isolated groups of survivors, each carrying slightly different subsets of human genetic variation. Some groups probably had higher frequencies of certain traits purely by chance. Maybe one refuge population happened to have unusually tall individuals. Another happened to have people with better cold tolerance. Not because these traits were being selected for, but because these were the people who happened to survive. As these groups eventually expanded after the bottleneck ended, they carried their founder population's genetic peculiarities with them. This is why modern human populations show subtle differences in height, body build, cold tolerance, disease resistance. Not because different environments strongly selected for these traits, though that played a role, but because different founder populations happen to carry different variants, and those variants spread as populations expanded. But here's the really critical point about bottlenecks and human evolution. They stop everything. Or more precisely, they freeze evolutionary development in place. Natural selection requires variation to work with. If a population loses most of its genetic diversity, selection has fewer options. Evolution can't create completely new adaptations out of nowhere. It can only work with the genetic variation already present in the population. The human bottleneck stripped away most of our species' genetic variation. Whatever traits, whatever adaptations humans possessed when entering the bottleneck, became the permanent blueprint for our species. There simply wasn't enough variation left for major new evolutionary developments. We were locked into our existing body plan, our existing physiology, our existing basic capabilities. This is why human physical evolution essentially paused. Not because we stopped experiencing natural selection, we didn't, but because we lacked the genetic raw material for selection to produce major changes. The humans who entered the bottleneck and the humans who emerged tens of thousands of years later were, in physical terms, essentially identical. Same body plan, same brain size, same basic capabilities. And here's the truly remarkable part. Those bottleneck survivors, those few thousand individuals who somehow kept humanity alive through the worst environmental crisis our species ever faced, they're your ancestors. Every person reading this, listening to this, every human alive today descends from that tiny population of survivors. We all carry the genetic signature of the bottleneck, the reduced diversity, the founder effects, the traits that persisted not because they were optimal, but because they were what we had. You are the product of the worst disaster in human history and the greatest survival story ever told. Your existence proves that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, a few individuals can be tough enough, smart enough, and lucky enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. But you're also the product of evolutionary stasis, carrying a body essentially unchanged since before the bottleneck, because the bottleneck eliminated the variation needed for major evolutionary change. This is the paradox at the heart of human evolution. The same event that nearly destroyed us also froze us in place, locking in our physical form for the next 100,000 years and counting. We stopped evolving, not because we were perfect, but because we'd lost the genetic diversity needed to evolve further. What happened next would change everything, but not through evolution, through something entirely different, something that would make biological evolution almost irrelevant to human success. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Here's where the story gets really strange. You'd think that after surviving the worst environmental catastrophe in human history, after being refined by 117,000 years of brutal natural selection, after spreading across the entire planet and encountering every climate and environment imaginable, human evolution would have kicked into high gear. We should have kept changing, kept adapting, kept diversifying into radically different forms suited to our new homes. But we didn't. Take a moment to think about this. The ancestors who walked out of Africa 60,000 years ago were physically almost identical to us. Same height range, same bone structure, same brain size, same basic body plan. They could wear our clothes. They could pass for modern humans on any street in any city. Now compare that to what happened to dogs in just 15,000 years of domestication. From wolves to Chihuahuas and Great Danes. Radical transformation in body size, shape, behavior, everything. Or look at Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. Different islands, different beak shapes, different species, all diverging in just a few million years. But humans? We spread from tropical Africa to Arctic Siberia, from sea level to the Himalayan plateau, from rainforest to deserts, and we barely changed at all. Sure, we developed different skin colors, different hair textures, subtle variations in facial features. But these are cosmetic differences, surface adaptations. Underneath, we're all running the same basic hardware. The Inuit living in Arctic Canada, where winter temperatures can hit -50 degrees Celsius, they have the same body plan as the Hadza living in tropical Tanzania where it never freezes. The Sherpa adapted to life at 5,000 meters in the Himalayas. They have the same basic physiology as the Bayou sea nomads who spend half their lives underwater in Southeast Asia. This isn't normal. This isn't how evolution usually works. So what happened? Why did human physical evolution essentially stop just when it should have been accelerating? The answer starts with understanding what evolution actually requires. And here's where most people get it wrong. Evolution isn't some mystical force that makes organisms better or more advanced. It's just a process. A simple algorithm that requires three things: variation, inheritance, and selection. Variation means individuals in a population have to be different from each other genetically. Inheritance means those genetic differences have to be passed to offspring. Selection means some variants have to survive and reproduce more successfully than others. When all three conditions are met, evolution happens automatically. The variants that help survival become more common. The variants that hinder survival become rare or disappear. Over time, the population changes. Given enough time and strong enough selection pressures, you get new species. But here's the thing. The genetic bottleneck had gutted human variation. Remember those 1,280 breeding individuals. They carried only a tiny fraction of the genetic diversity that had existed in the pre-bottleneck population, and that reduced diversity meant evolution had less raw material to work with. Think of it like this. If you're trying to build different types of houses but you only have 10 different kinds of bricks, your options are limited. Evolution was trying to adapt humans to dozens of different environments, but the genetic toolkit had been reduced to bare essentials during the bottleneck. And it gets worse. After the bottleneck ended and human populations began expanding again, you'd expect genetic diversity to gradually increase through new mutations. And it did, but incredibly slowly. Mutations happen at a fairly constant rate, roughly one new mutation per 100 million base pairs per generation. That sounds like a lot until you realize the human genome has 3 billion base pairs, and most mutations are either neutral or harmful. Beneficial mutations, the kind that actually help survival, they're rare. Maybe one in every 10,000 mutations actually improves something. And even when a beneficial mutation appears, it has to spread through the entire population before it can have species-wide effects. That takes time, lots of time, especially in large populations. And here's the kicker. Human populations, even after the recovery, remained relatively small and geographically isolated for most of our history. Those groups that left Africa 60,000 years ago, they were tiny, maybe a few hundred individuals initially. The populations that reached Europe, that pushed into Asia, that eventually crossed into the Americas, each founding population was a small subset of the previous group. This created what geneticists call serial founder effects. Each time a small group split off to colonize new territory, they carried only a fraction of the genetic diversity from their parent population. The Americas were colonized by maybe 200 individuals who crossed from Siberia. They carried only the genetic variants that happened to be present in that small founding group. Small populations mean reduced genetic diversity. Reduced genetic diversity means fewer variants for natural selection to work with. Fewer variants means slower evolution. It's a feedback loop that kept human physical evolution in slow motion, even as we were spreading across the planet. But there's another factor, maybe the most important one, the selection pressures that drive evolution. They weren't acting on human bodies anymore. They were acting on human brains and human cultures. See, most species adapt to new environments through biological evolution. Birds developing different beak shapes for different food sources. Mammals growing thicker fur for colder climates. Fish changing body shapes for different water conditions. But humans did something different. Something unprecedented. We adapted through technology and culture instead of through physical change. When humans moved into cold climates, we didn't evolve thick fur like mammoths. We invented clothing and shelter. When we encountered new food sources that were hard to digest, we didn't evolve new digestive systems. We invented cooking and food processing. When we needed to hunt faster prey, we didn't evolve longer legs. We invented better weapons. This is the key to understanding the evolutionary pause. Every time human populations encountered a new environmental challenge, we solved it culturally before natural selection had time to produce biological adaptations. And once you solve a problem with technology, the selection pressure for biological solutions disappears. Take cold tolerance. In the Arctic, temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. You'd expect natural selection to favor individuals with higher metabolic rates, better fat storage, reduced surface area to volume ratios, all the biological adaptations we see in Arctic mammals. And there is some evidence of this. Populations that have lived in extremely cold climates for thousands of years do show slightly higher metabolic rates and different fat distribution patterns. But these changes are subtle, minor tweaks to an existing system. Nothing like the radical adaptations that Arctic foxes or polar bears evolved. Why? Because humans figured out clothing, fire, and insulated shelters within a few generations of reaching cold environments. The selection pressure for biological cold adaptation was minimal. If you can survive Arctic winter with good caribou skin clothing and a warm shelter, it doesn't matter whether your metabolism is slightly more or less efficient. You survive either way. The same pattern played out everywhere humans went. Every environmental challenge was met with a cultural or technological solution that arrived faster than biological evolution could respond. The selection pressures that shape other species, they were being intercepted and neutralized by human innovation, and this happened because of what the bottleneck had done to human brains. Those 117,000 years of near extinction, they had selected intensely for intelligence, problem-solving ability, cooperation, and the capacity to learn and transmit complex information. The humans who survived the bottleneck weren't necessarily stronger or faster, or more physically robust than their ancestors. They were smarter. They were better at working together. They were better at inventing solutions to novel problems. When those cognitive abilities were unleashed during the post-bottleneck expansion, they changed everything. Human adaptation shifted from biological evolution, which takes thousands of generations, to cultural evolution, which can happen in years or even months. A biological adaptation to high altitude, like the genetic variants that help Tibetans process oxygen more efficiently, that takes thousands of years to evolve and spread through a population. But cultural adaptations to high altitude, like building rest stops along mountain passes or developing breathing techniques, those can spread through an entire population in a single generation. This is what biologists call niche construction. Instead of evolving to fit their environment, humans were modifying their environment to fit their existing biology. And once you start doing that, the selective pressures that drive physical evolution largely disappear. But there's a cost to this strategy. We're stuck with bodies designed for a world that no longer exists. Our spines evolved for quadrupedal locomotion and then got jury-rigged for upright walking, which is why back pain is nearly universal. Our brains grew rapidly in size, which is why human childbirth is so dangerous compared to other primates. Our dietary systems evolved for a varied diet of fruits, tubers, and occasional meat, which is why modern processed foods cause so many health problems. Biologists call this evolutionary lag. Our environment has changed far faster than our biology can keep up with. We have Paleolithic bodies living in a space-age world, and unlike other species which either evolve to match their new environment or go extinct, humans just keep modifying the environment to accommodate our outdated biology. Feel pain from sitting in chairs all day? Your spine is designed for walking and climbing. Got vision problems? Your eyes evolved for distance viewing in open landscapes, not for staring at screens 8 inches from your face. Trouble sleeping? Your circadian rhythms are set by natural light cycles that most people never experience anymore. Anxiety, depression, stress disorders, Your threat response system evolved for immediate physical dangers, not for the abstract psychological pressures of modern life. We are, in the most literal sense, living fossils, bodies shaped by selection pressures that stopped applying 100,000 years ago, running on genetic programs written during the bottleneck, trying to function in environments our ancestors could never have imagined. And here's what really wild. We're probably stuck this way. The conditions that allowed rapid human evolution during the bottleneck, tiny populations under extreme selective pressure, those conditions don't exist anymore. Modern human populations are huge, globally connected and environmentally protected by technology. The selection pressures are minimal. Genetic diversity is increasing, but slowly. And cultural evolution is now so fast that it solves problems before biological evolution even gets started. There are exceptions, of course. Small populations in extreme environments can still evolve relatively quickly. The Bauhaus sea nomads have developed genetic variants that give them larger spleens, which helps them hold their breath longer when diving. Some populations have evolved adult lactose tolerance in just the last 10,000 years, after they started herding dairy animals. There's evidence of ongoing selection for disease resistance, particularly in populations exposed to endemic diseases like malaria. But these are minor adjustments, tweaks to existing systems. Nothing like the wholesale body plan changes that define evolution in other species. The basic human form, the skeleton, the organ systems, the brain structure, these haven't changed significantly in 100,000 years, and barring some catastrophic population collapse or radical new environmental pressure, they probably won't change much in the next 100,000 years either. We are the species that stopped evolving, not because we reached some pinnacle of perfection, not because evolution decided we were done, but because we got smart enough to make evolution largely irrelevant. We adapted through culture and technology instead of through genes and natural selection. It's an unprecedented strategy in the history of life on Earth, and it's made us the most successful large mammal that has ever existed. We occupy more of the planet than any other species our size. We exist in greater numbers than ecological models say should be possible. We've survived climates and conditions that should have required radical biological adaptations, all without significantly changing our basic body plan. But it's also left us with bodies that are increasingly mismatched to our environments. The faster our cultures and technologies change, the larger that mismatch becomes. We're running Stone Age hardware on quantum computing problems and feeling the strain. The evolutionary pause continues, and understanding why our bodies stopped changing helps explain why being human is so often uncomfortable in the modern world. We're not broken, we're not defective. We're just using 100,000-year-old equipment for tasks it was never designed to handle. And that's the story of how humanity became the frozen species, the population that survived the bottleneck and then stopped evolving, just when evolution should have mattered most. But if our bodies stopped changing, something else was just beginning, something that would prove far more powerful than any biological adaptation could ever be. Human culture was about to explode. So here's where everything changes. Here's where human evolution takes the most unexpected turn in the history of life on Earth. Your ancestors survived the bottleneck. They endured 117,000 years of near extinction. They emerged with bigger brains, better cooperation, enhanced problem-solving abilities. Evolution had refined them into the most adaptable species the planet had ever seen. And then, right when you'd expect biological evolution to kick into high gear, something completely unprecedented happened. It stopped mattering. Not completely, not all at once, but around 100,000 years ago, the primary driver of human adaptation shifted from genes to something else entirely. Culture. This wasn't subtle. This was revolutionary. For billions of years, every organism that wanted to survive in a new environment had to evolve new adaptations biologically. Want to live in cold climates? Better evolve thick fur over hundreds of thousands of years. Need to hunt faster prey? Hope natural selection gives your descendants longer legs and better reflexes. Running out of food sources? Wait a few million years for your species to develop the ability to digest something new. But humans figured out a cheat code. Instead of waiting for evolution to slowly modify their bodies, they started modifying everything around them, and they started modifying their behavior faster than genes could ever change. Cold climate? Don't evolve fur. Kill an animal and wear its fur. Need to hunt faster prey? Don't evolve longer legs. Invent better weapons. Running out of food? Don't wait for your digestive system to adapt. Figure out how to cook, preserve, and process foods that would otherwise be inedible. This is cultural evolution, and it moves at a speed that makes biological evolution look frozen in place. Think about what this means. A genetic adaptation takes thousands, usually tens of thousands of generations to spread through a population. You need a beneficial mutation to occur randomly. Then that mutation needs to provide enough survival advantage that individuals carrying it reproduce more successfully than those who don't. Then over countless generations, the frequency of that genetic variant slowly increases until it becomes common in the population. This process is slow, painfully slow. We're talking timescales of hundreds of thousands to millions of years for major changes. But cultural adaptation, that can happen in a single generation. One clever individual figures out a better way to make a spear point, and within months, everyone in their group has adopted the new technique. A group discovers that cooking certain plants makes them digestible, and within a year, that knowledge has spread to neighbouring groups through trade networks. This is faster than evolution by orders of magnitude. And around 100,000 years ago, the archaeological record shows this cultural evolution exploding into something the world had never seen. The first signs appear as changes in stone tools. For nearly 2 million years, human tool technology have been relatively stable. Hand axes, choppers, simple flake tools. Designs change slowly. Improvements took hundreds of thousands of years to develop and spread. Then suddenly, around 100,000 years ago in Africa, the tools start getting sophisticated, complex, specialized. Archaeological sites from this period show dozens of different tool types, each designed for specific tasks. Scrapers for processing hides, points for spears, blades for cutting, awls for making holes in leather. This isn't just tool use anymore. This is tool engineering. This is understanding abstract principles like leverage, edge angles, and material properties. But tools are just the beginning. The really revolutionary changes are happening in realms that are harder to see in the fossil record but no less profound. Language. Around this time, maybe earlier, maybe a bit later, human communication crosses a threshold. We go from simple vocalizations and gestures to true symbolic language, the ability to use arbitrary sounds to represent complex ideas, to discuss things that aren't physically present, to convey information about the past and future, to share knowledge that took years to acquire in conversations that last minutes. Nobody knows exactly when language emerged. Vocal cords don't fossilize. Grammar doesn't leave archaeological traces. But everything points to this period as when human language became sophisticated enough to fundamentally change how we survived. The spread of complex tool technologies requires detailed verbal instruction, The coordination evident in hunting strategies suggests elaborate planning and discussion. The social structures we can infer from burial patterns imply negotiations, alliances, and agreements that would be impossible without sophisticated communication. And once you have language, everything else follows. You can teach complex skills to your children without them having to figure everything out through trial and error. You can share information about dangerous plants, reliable water sources, animal migration patterns. You can coordinate group activities with precision, hunt cooperatively, build shelters together, plan for seasons ahead. Most importantly, you can tell stories. This might not sound revolutionary, but storytelling changes everything. Stories allow you to preserve knowledge across generations without genetic encoding. Your grandmother can tell you about the terrible drought that happened before you were born, and you can prepare for the next one. Your uncle can describe a successful hunting technique he learned from his father, and you can use it without having to rediscover it yourself. Knowledge becomes cumulative. Each generation doesn't start from zero. They start from everything the previous generation learned, then add their own discoveries. This is exponential growth in adaptive capacity, and it's happening entirely through cultural transmission, not genetic inheritance. The archaeological evidence gets more dramatic as we move forward from 100,000 years ago. Around 75,000 years ago, we start seeing the first unambiguous symbolic artifacts. Pieces of ochre, a red mineral with deliberate engravings on them. Geometric patterns that serve no practical purpose. These are symbols, abstract representations, evidence that humans were thinking about concepts beyond immediate survival. Why does this matter? Because symbolic thinking is the foundation of everything else. It's what lets you use one thing to represent another thing. It's what makes language possible, using sounds to represent objects and ideas. It's what enables art, mathematics, writing, all of civilization. And it's what allows you to manipulate concepts in your mind without having to physically interact with the real world. With symbolic thinking, you can plan. Not just I'll go to that water source tomorrow, but if we store enough food now, we can survive the dry season 3 months from now. You can innovate. This spear design works, but what if we made it differently? You can teach abstract principles. The best stone for tools is usually found near rivers. You can create culture that persists across generations and evolves faster than genes ever could. Fire was probably the first and most important cultural adaptation. Humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe over 1 million. But around this period, fire use becomes systematic, controlled, and central to human survival. Archaeological sites show hearths, deliberately constructed fire pits used repeatedly. This isn't just grabbing burning branches from lightning strikes anymore. This is fire management. And fire is a biological game changer that requires no biological changes. It lets you live in cold climates without evolving cold adaptations. It lets you eat foods that would be toxic or indigestible raw, massively expanding your dietary options without modifying your digestive system. It provides light, extending your active hours into darkness. It offers protection from predators. It becomes a social focus, a gathering place where groups can share food and stories. Cooking might be the most underrated innovation in human history. When you cook food, you're essentially pre-digesting it externally, breaking down tough fibers, destroying toxins, making nutrients more accessible. This means you can extract far more calories from the same amount of food. You can eat plants that would sicken you raw. You can consume meat that would be crawling with parasites when fresh. The energy savings are enormous. Instead of needing massive jaws and huge digestive systems to process tough raw foods like other primates, humans can have smaller jaws, smaller guts, and redirect that saved energy elsewhere, like to our brains. Some researchers think cooking is what allowed human brains to grow as large as they did. We're literally using cultural innovation, controlled fire and food preparation, to fuel the biological organ that generates more cultural innovation. Clothing is another cultural adaptation that replaces biological evolution. Other mammals that moved into cold climates evolved thick fur over hundreds of thousands of years. Humans? We killed animals and wore their fur. We learned to scrape hides clean, to soften leather, to cut and stitch pieces together into fitted garments. The earliest evidence of systematic clothing production comes from around 70,000 years ago. We find scrapers designed specifically for hide processing. We find bone awls for punching holes in leather. Eventually we find actual needles for sewing. This is technology replacing evolution. Instead of waiting millions of years to evolve biological cold adaptations, humans developed cultural solutions that let them move into Arctic environments while keeping their tropical adapted bodies unchanged. Shelter works the same way. Instead of evolving to hibernate through harsh seasons or developing biological mechanisms to regulate temperature in extreme cold, humans built structures. At first, simple windbreaks and rock overhangs, then increasingly sophisticated shelters made from branches, hides, bones, eventually stone, each improvement happening through cultural innovation, spreading through social learning, requiring no genetic changes whatsoever. But the most profound cultural evolution was happening in how humans organized themselves socially. The bottleneck had created a situation where cooperation wasn't just helpful, it was mandatory. Groups that couldn't work together effectively simply didn't survive. This selected for certain traits, sure, but more importantly it created cultural systems of cooperation that could be taught and refined. Extended kinship networks emerged. Not just immediate family, but recognition of relationships across multiple generations and through marriage alliances. These networks created obligations. If you were part of my extended kin group, I had responsibilities to help you, and you had responsibilities to help me. This created safety nets that no individual could provide alone. Trade networks developed, connecting groups separated by hundreds of miles. Archaeological sites from 100,000 years ago show stone tools made from raw materials that could only have come from sources days or weeks of travel away. This isn't just occasional exchange. This is systematic trade, regular contact between groups, relationships maintained across space and time. These networks served multiple functions. They distributed resources from regions of abundance to regions of scarcity. They spread innovations rapidly. Groups that developed better techniques could trade that knowledge for goods or form alliances. Most importantly, they provided genetic diversity. Small, isolated groups face inbreeding problems, but groups connected through trade networks could arrange marriages that brought in new genetic lineages. All of this required sophisticated social rules. Who could marry whom? How trades would be conducted fairly? How conflicts would be resolved without destroying the network? How knowledge would be shared? These rules weren't genetic. They were cultural, passed down through teaching and storytelling, modified when they didn't work, refined over generations. And here's the incredible thing about cultural evolution. It's Lamarckian. Remember Lamarck? The guy who thought giraffes stretch their necks to reach high leaves and pass those longer necks to their offspring. He was wrong about biological evolution. Acquired characteristics don't get inherited genetically, but cultural evolution, that's exactly how it works. If you learn a better hunting technique, you can teach it directly to your children. If you acquire knowledge about plant medicines, you can pass that knowledge immediately to the next generation. Cultural adaptations really do work through inheritance of acquired characteristics. This makes cultural evolution fundamentally different from and much faster than biological evolution. By 60,000 years ago, when modern humans finally left Africa and began encountering Neanderthals and Denisovans, cultural evolution had become humanity's primary survival strategy. Yes, we still had the biological adaptations from the bottleneck, the enhanced brains, the cooperative instincts, the physical resilience. But what really made modern humans successful wasn't their bodies, it was their culture. The archaeological record from this period shows something unprecedented in the history of life. Human technology and social organization evolving at accelerating rates while human biology remains essentially static. We're adapting faster than evolution can track, solving problems through innovation rather than natural selection, spreading solutions through teaching rather than genetic inheritance. This is why humans stopped evolving in the traditional sense, not because natural selection stopped acting on us, but because we developed an alternative adaptation mechanism that was faster, more flexible, and more powerful. We'd stumbled onto a new strategy for survival that would eventually let us colonize every terrestrial environment on the planet without changing our basic biology. We became the first species to escape the constraints of evolutionary timescales, the first organism to adapt through learned behavior rather than inherited physiology, the first animal to survive through what we knew rather than what we were. And we did it all, with Ice Age bodies and Stone Age genes. Because once cultural evolution takes over, you don't need to evolve anymore, you just need to innovate. And humans, we became very, very good at innovation. Here's the thing that nobody tells you about human evolution. It stopped. Not completely, not forever, but effectively. For the last 100,000 years, your body has been frozen in evolutionary time. You're walking around in 2024 with basically the same biological hardware that your ancestors had when they were dodging saber-toothed cats in the African savannah. The same heart, the same lungs, the same digestive system, the same brain architecture, all designed for a world that no longer exists. Think about that for a second. Your body expects you to wake up at dawn, spend most of your day walking, maybe run occasionally when chasing prey or fleeing predators, eat foods you gathered or hunted yourself, and go to sleep when it gets dark. Instead, you wake up to an alarm clock, sit in a chair for 8 hours, eat food that comes in packages, and stay awake long past sunset staring at screens. Your biology is screaming instructions for one kind of life while you're living a completely different one. This is the modern human paradox, and it's making us sick in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. Let's start with the most obvious mismatch: your skeleton. Those bones holding you upright right now were designed by natural selection for constant movement across varied terrain. Walking, running, climbing, crouching, squatting. Your Paleolithic ancestors spent maybe 10 to 15 hours a day on their feet. Not running constantly, that would be exhausting, but moving. Foraging for plants, tracking animals, gathering firewood, processing food, creating tools. They sat down to rest, but they didn't have chairs. They squatted or sat cross-legged on the ground, positions that kept their core engaged and their joints mobile. Your spine, in particular, is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering for a very specific use case. Those curves, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, they're shock absorbers designed to handle the repetitive impact of bipedal locomotion across rough ground. The intervertebral discs between your vertebrae are like little hydraulic cushions, perfect for absorbing the stress of walking mile after mile. But here's the problem. That same spine, so beautifully adapted for walking, is terrible at prolonged sitting. When you sit, especially in modern chairs, those curves flatten out. The pressure on your intervertebral discs increases by about 40% compared to standing. Your core muscles, which should be constantly engaged to stabilize your spine during movement, switch off. Over time, they atrophy. This is why back pain has become an epidemic. Not because our spines are poorly designed, but because they're perfectly designed for a lifestyle we no longer live. Lower back pain affects about 80% of people at some point in their lives. Our Paleolithic ancestors. Archaeological evidence suggests they had remarkably healthy spines well into old age. The difference isn't genetics, it's use. They used their bodies the way evolution designed them to be used. We don't. And it's not just your back. Your feet have the same problem. You have 26 bones in each foot, 33 joints, more than 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments. This is an incredibly complex piece of engineering, designed to handle varied terrain, provide sensory feedback about ground conditions, and adapt to slopes, rocks, and uneven surfaces. Your ancestors walked barefoot or in minimal footwear. Their feet were strong, mobile, capable of gripping ground and flexing to absorb impact. Modern shoes, especially the kind with thick cushioned soles and rigid arch support, do all that work for you. Which sounds great until you realize that muscles that don't get used become weak. Your feet have essentially been in cast for most of your life. This leads to all kinds of problems. Plantar fasciitis, bunions, hammer toes, flat feet. These conditions were extremely rare in populations that went barefoot. They're endemic in populations that wear modern shoes. Your feet aren't broken, they're just not being used the way evolution intended. But the mismatch goes deeper than just musculoskeletal issues. Your entire metabolic system, the way your body processes and stores energy, is calibrated for a world of scarcity and uncertainty. Your Paleolithic ancestors never knew when their next meal was coming. Maybe they'd kill a large animal and feast for days. Maybe they'd go through a lean period with nothing but gathered plants and occasional small game. This unpredictability shaped your metabolism in profound ways. Your body is exceptionally good at storing energy as fat. Any excess calories you consume, anything beyond your immediate energy needs, gets converted to adipose tissue. This was a brilliant survival strategy 100,000 years ago. Those fat stores could keep you alive during periods when food was scarce. The individuals whose bodies were most efficient at storing fat during good times were the ones who survived bad times. They were the ones who reproduced. You inherited their genes. The problem is, for most people in developed countries, bad times never come. Food is available 24/7, cheap, calorie-dense food at that. Your body is still operating on Ice Age programming, trying to store every extra calorie in case of famine, but the famine never arrives. The result is obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, conditions that were virtually unknown in hunter-gatherer populations, not because they had better genetics, but because their environment matched their biology. Your insulin response shows the same mismatch. Insulin is the hormone that regulates blood sugar. When you eat, your blood glucose rises, and your pancreas releases insulin to shuttle that glucose into cells where it can be used or stored. This system works beautifully when you're eating the kinds of foods your ancestors ate. Whole foods with fiber, protein, fat, nutrients in complex combinations. These foods are absorbed relatively slowly. Your blood sugar rises gradually. Your pancreas releases a measured amount of insulin. Everything stays balanced. Then you eat a candy bar or drink a soda or eat a bowl of refined cereal. Pure, rapidly absorbed sugar hits your bloodstream like a flood. Your blood glucose spikes dramatically. Your pancreas panics and dumps massive amounts of insulin into your system. Your blood sugar crashes, often dropping below where it started. Now you feel hungry again even though you just ate, so you eat more simple carbs. The cycle repeats. Over years, your cells become resistant to insulin. Your pancreas has to produce more and more to get the same effect. Eventually, the system breaks down entirely. Type 2 diabetes. This isn't a design flaw. This is a perfectly good system being asked to handle inputs it was never designed for. Your ancestors didn't have access to refined sugars and processed carbohydrates. The sweetest thing they might encounter was honey, and even that was rare and came mixed with wax and pollen, moderating its absorption. Their diet consisted of things that had to be chewed extensively, that released energy slowly, that came packaged with fiber and micronutrients. Their metabolic systems never had to deal with the concentrated calorie bombs that fill modern supermarkets. The same evolutionary logic explains why fat, especially saturated fat, tastes so good to you. For your Paleolithic ancestors, animal fat was an incredibly valuable resource. It's the most calorie-dense food in nature. 9 calories per gram compared to 4 for carbohydrates or protein. Getting fat meant survival. Your brain developed reward pathways that flooded you with pleasure chemicals when you ate fatty foods, encouraging you to seek them out and consume as much as possible when available. Those same reward pathways are still active. They make you crave cheeseburgers and ice cream. They made perfect sense in a world of scarcity. They're causing a health crisis in a world of abundance. But perhaps the most profound mismatch is in your sleep patterns. Your circadian rhythm, the internal clock that regulates sleep and wakefulness, is controlled by exposure to light. Specifically, blue light wavelengths that signal daytime. Your ancestors woke when the sun rose, spent their day outdoors under natural light, and as evening approached, were exposed only to the warm, reddish light of fires. Their melatonin production, the hormone that induces sleep, ramped up naturally as the light changed. By the time full darkness arrived, they were ready for sleep. You, on the other hand, are exposed to bright artificial light until the moment you decide to sleep. Overhead lights, computer screens, smartphones, all emitting blue light that tells your brain it's still daytime. Your melatonin production is suppressed. Even when you finally turn off the lights and lie down, your brain is still in daytime mode. This is why so many people struggle with insomnia, not because there's something wrong with their sleep systems, but because those systems are receiving confusing signals from an environment they weren't designed to handle. The effects of chronic sleep disruption cascade through every system in your body. Immune function declines. Metabolic regulation becomes impaired. Cognitive performance suffers. Emotional regulation breaks down. Your Paleolithic ancestors probably slept 8 to 10 hours a night in alignment with natural light cycles. Modern humans average about 6.8 hours, often of poor quality. We're running on a sleep deficit that our biology simply wasn't designed to handle. Then there's stress. Your stress response system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is a marvel of evolutionary engineering. When you encounter a threat, your body shifts into emergency mode. Cortisol and adrenaline flood your system. Your heart rate increases. Blood flow is redirected from non-essential systems like digestion to muscles that might need to fight or flee. Your pupils dilate. Your attention narrows to focus on the immediate threat. This response kept your ancestors alive when they encountered predators or hostile groups. The threat would appear, the stress response would activate, the situation would resolve one way or another, and the system would reset. But your stress response doesn't distinguish between a saber-toothed cat and a nasty email from your boss. It treats them the same way. Threat detected, emergency mode activated. The problem is, the email doesn't go away after a few minutes. It sits in your inbox. The deadline keeps approaching. Your mortgage payment is still due. Your stress response stays activated, sometimes for hours, days, weeks. Chronic stress elevation. Your body is constantly in emergency mode, burning through resources, suppressing long-term maintenance systems like immune function and tissue repair, because it thinks you're in immediate danger. Your ancestors experienced acute stress followed by resolution. You experience chronic stress without resolution. The system isn't broken, it's just being used in a way it wasn't designed for. The result is anxiety, depression, cardiovascular disease, suppressed immune function, accelerated aging. All downstream consequences of a stress response system that's stuck in the on position. Even your social instincts are mismatched with modern life. Humans evolved as intensely social creatures, but in very specific group sizes and structures. Anthropological evidence suggests our ancestors lived in bands of 20 to 50 individuals, part of larger tribal networks of maybe 150 to 200 people. These were your people. You knew everyone. You saw them daily. You cooperated on survival tasks. You shared resources. You told stories around fires. You participated in rituals that reinforced group identity. Your brain is wired for this kind of intimate social world. You have the cognitive capacity to maintain maybe 150 meaningful relationships. British anthropologist Robin Dunbar called this Dunbar's number. It's the maximum number of people you can know well enough to ask for a favour. Your brain can track social obligations, relationships, status hierarchies for about 150 people. Beyond that, things get fuzzy. Modern life violates this in every direction. You're surrounded by thousands, maybe millions of people in cities. You encounter hundreds of faces every day on commutes and in public spaces. Your brain can't process this. You end up treating the vast majority of humans you encounter as NPCs, background characters in your life. At the same time, you might know only a handful of people with real intimacy. You don't have the band, the tribe, the village. You have a fragmented network of relationships mediated by screens and schedules. Social media makes this even worse. Now you're supposed to maintain connections with hundreds, maybe thousands of online contacts. Your brain, calibrated for face-to-face interaction with 150 people maximum, is overwhelmed. The result is the paradox of being constantly connected yet profoundly lonely. This isn't a personal failing. This is biology meeting an environment it wasn't designed for. Understanding all this, the deep mismatch between our Paleolithic bodies and modern lives, isn't just interesting evolutionary trivia. It's the key to making better choices about how you live. Your body isn't malfunctioning when you gain weight easily, when your back hurts after sitting all day, when you can't fall asleep at night, when you feel anxious and disconnected. Your body is functioning exactly as designed. It's just designed for a different world. The solution isn't to reject modern life and try to live like a hunter-gatherer. That's neither practical nor desirable, but you can make adjustments that honor your evolutionary heritage while enjoying modern benefits. Move more, throughout the day, in varied ways. Eat whole foods that would have been recognizable to your ancestors. Regulate your light exposure. Prioritize sleep. Find ways to manage stress that include physical resolution. Exercise, basically. Cultivate real social connections with a manageable number of people. None of this is about romanticizing the past. Paleolithic life was hard, dangerous, and short. Modern medicine, technology, and social organization have given us longer, healthier, more comfortable lives than our ancestors could have imagined. But we pay a price when we ignore the fundamental realities of our biology. You're living in an Ice Age body, carrying genetic instructions written during the worst environmental crisis in human history, navigating a world that changes faster than evolution possibly can. The more you understand that mismatch, the better equipped you are to bridge it. Your body is trying to help you survive. It's just using strategies that worked 100,000 years ago. Your job is to translate those ancient imperatives into a modern context, to give your Ice Age body what it needs while living a 21st century life. That's the modern human paradox, and learning to navigate it might be the most important survival skill you ever develop. So the bottleneck ends, the climate finally begins to stabilize, and humanity catches its breath after the longest near-death experience in our species' history. But here's what most people don't realize. Those survivors, those few thousand individuals who made it through 117,000 years of environmental hell, they weren't just going to bounce back and spread across the world immediately. They were traumatized, genetically depleted, and scattered across whatever corners of Africa had kept them alive. Picture the world around 60,000 years ago. Your ancestors have spent hundreds of generations learning to survive in a very specific set of African environments. They know which plants are edible, which water sources are reliable, whether game animals migrate during different seasons. They've perfected survival in their little corner of the world. And now you're asking them to leave, to walk away from everything they know and venture into completely unknown territories. That's exactly what happened, and it changed everything. The Out of Africa migration wasn't some grand planned expedition. It wasn't thousands of people deciding to march north in search of new lands. It was probably much smaller, much more desperate. Maybe a few extended family groups, perhaps 200 or 300 individuals total, who found themselves pushed to the margins of their territories. Maybe their region was getting overcrowded. Maybe they were fleeing conflict with neighboring groups. Maybe they were just following game animals that were migrating into new areas as the climate shifted. Whatever the reason, they left. And when they did, they were carrying something unprecedented. Not just their genes, not just their stone tools, but something far more powerful. They were carrying culture, knowledge accumulated over thousands of generations, stories about how their ancestors had survived when everything went wrong, technologies that had been refined through trial and error over millennia. These weren't primitive humans stumbling blindly into an unknown world. These were the descendants of the bottleneck survivors, the most evolutionarily tested, culturally sophisticated humans who had ever existed. And they were about to prove it. The first migrations probably followed the coast. Basic survival strategy: stay near water, follow the shoreline, exploit marine resources as you go. Archaeological evidence suggests these early migrants were sophisticated seafood collectors. Shell middens, ancient garbage dumps of discarded shells and bones, show up along ancient coastlines from the Red Sea to Southeast Asia. These people weren't just eating whatever they found. They were systematically harvesting shellfish, fish, seabirds, even marine mammals. They had figured out how to exploit an entirely new food source that most of their African ancestors had never seriously utilized. This coastal migration strategy was brilliant for several reasons. Coastlines provide consistent resources year-round. When inland game is scarce, the ocean keeps producing. Coastal routes also provide natural highways. You don't need complex navigation. Just follow the shore, and crucially, coasts connect. Follow the shore of Africa long enough, and you end up in the Middle East. Keep going, and you're in Asia. Within just a few thousand years, barely a blink in evolutionary terms, the descendants of those first migrants had spread along the entire southern coast of Asia. Archaeological sites in Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, even Australia, all show signs of human occupation dating to between 60,000 and 50,000 years ago. These are the coastal pioneers moving faster than any human population had ever moved before, not because they were more mobile, but because they had figured out how to take their food supply with them. But here's where it gets really interesting. As these groups spread, they weren't evolving into different species. Remember, the bottleneck had done something unique to human genetics. We had already been through the evolutionary ringer. Our genes had been selected for adaptability, for the ability to survive dramatic environmental changes. So when these migrants encountered new environments, tropical rainforests, seasonal monsoon regions, arid deserts, they didn't need biological evolution to survive. They had something better. Cultural adaptation. A group moving into a tropical rainforest didn't need to evolve new digestive systems to handle different foods. They just needed to figure out which plants were safe to eat, how to process toxic foods to remove poisons, which animals could be hunted effectively. This knowledge could be learned, tested, refined, and passed down within a single generation. Evolution would take thousands of generations to accomplish the same thing. The archaeological record from this period shows an explosion of specialized tools. Groups in forested regions developed sophisticated traps and snares. Those in open grasslands refined long-distance projectile weapons. Coastal populations created specialized fishing gear. Each group was adapting rapidly to local conditions, but they were doing it through innovation, not evolution. And then they met their cousins. Somewhere in the Middle East, maybe along the eastern Mediterranean coast, or perhaps in the mountains of the Caucasus, modern humans migrating out of Africa encountered populations that had left much earlier. Neanderthals. These weren't strangers, not really. They were the descendants of humans who had left Africa hundreds of thousands of years earlier, who had been adapting to Ice Age Europe while our ancestors were surviving the bottleneck in Africa. We know what happened next because we can read it in our DNA. They had children together. Multiple times, over thousands of years, modern humans and Neanderthals formed relationships, had kids, and those children survived, reproduced, and passed on a mix of genes from both populations. Today, if you have any ancestry from outside Africa, you're carrying roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA. That's the genetic signature of Ice Age love stories written across tens of thousands of years. But this wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. Those Neanderthal genes weren't random. Natural selection kept the useful ones and discarded the rest. The Neanderthal genetic variants that show up most strongly in modern populations are related to immune function, skin pigmentation, and cold tolerance. In other words, modern humans entering Europe encountered new diseases, new climate challenges, new environmental stresses. And conveniently, they met populations that had already adapted to those challenges. By interbreeding, they essentially borrowed 400,000 years' worth of evolutionary adaptation in just a few generations. The same thing happened in Asia, but with a different group, Denisovans. We know even less about them because we've found only a handful of Denisovan fossils, mostly fragments from a single cave in Siberia. But their genetic legacy is everywhere. Modern populations across Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA. Some Pacific Islander groups have as much as 6%. And just like with Neanderthals, the Denisovan genes that persisted aren't random. They include variants that help process oxygen at high altitudes, still present in modern Tibetan populations. Variants related to immune function. Variants that help metabolize different types of foods. Think about what this means. As modern humans spread across the world, they weren't just adapting through their own innovations. They were incorporating genetic adaptations from populations that had been preparing for hundreds of thousands of years. It's like showing up to a foreign country and immediately downloading centuries of local knowledge directly into your DNA. Survival hacking on a genetic level. But here's the crucial part. Despite all this interbreeding, despite adapting to radically different environments from the Arctic to the tropics, despite developing completely different cultures, languages and technologies, humans remained one species. A human from Africa could have children with a Neanderthal. Those hybrid children could have children with Denisovans, and all of those descendants could interbreed freely with each other. The bottleneck had created a kind of genetic unity that was incredibly difficult to break. We'd all passed through the same evolutionary filter, all been refined by the same 117,000 years of selection pressure. That shared genetic heritage was strong enough that even hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution couldn't completely divide us. As human populations spread into new territories, they faced challenges that would have killed earlier human species. The first humans to push into northern Europe encountered winters that lasted 8 months, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees. They didn't evolve thick fur or hibernation abilities. They invented tailored clothing, built insulated shelters, learned to store food through long winters, and mastered fire to a degree that would have amazed their ancestors. The first humans to reach Australia, probably around 50,000 years ago, had to cross at least 50 miles of open ocean. They didn't evolve gills or fins. They built boats. They developed navigation techniques. They learned to read currents and weather patterns, and they successfully colonized an entire continent that had never seen human beings before. The groups that pushed into the Americas, crossing the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, encountered ecosystems filled with megafauna that had never learned to fear human hunters. Giant ground sloths, massive armadillos, American camels, saber-toothed cats. These migrants didn't evolve new hunting adaptations. They brought sophisticated weapons technology, coordinated hunting strategies, and within just a few thousand years had spread from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, adapting to every environment along the way. Each of these migrations was creating isolated populations, groups that might go thousands of years with limited contact with other human populations, and in that isolation they began to develop surface differences. Skin color adapted to local UV radiation levels. Body proportions shifted based on climate, people in colder regions becoming more compact to conserve heat, those in hotter regions becoming lankier to dissipate it. Facial features, hair texture, even lactose tolerance in populations that domesticated dairy animals, all of these were minor evolutionary tweaks, biological responses to local conditions. But underneath those surface differences, the fundamental human genome remained remarkably uniform. The genetic variation between any two humans from opposite sides of the planet is tiny compared to the variation you'd find between two chimpanzees from neighbouring groups in Africa. The bottleneck had seen to that. It had stripped away so much genetic diversity that even tens of thousands of years of separate evolution couldn't rebuild it. This is why race, as a biological concept, doesn't actually exist in humans. The visible differences between populations, skin colour, hair texture, facial features, represent tiny variations in a handful of genes. The overwhelming majority of human genetic variation, about 85%, exists within populations, not between them. You can find more genetic diversity in a single African village than exists between the average Asian and the average European. But while biology stayed largely the same, culture exploded in 1,000 different directions. Isolated populations developed completely different languages, religions, art styles, technologies, social structures. A group in the Amazon rainforest developed sophisticated knowledge of hundreds of medicinal plants. A group on the Eurasian steppe became master horse riders. Island populations in the Pacific became the world's greatest navigators, capable of crossing thousands of miles of open ocean using only stars and wave patterns. This cultural diversity, arising from the same genetic stock, proves something profound about the bottleneck's legacy. The evolutionary pressures of those 117,000 years didn't just select for intelligence or adaptability in general, they selected for extreme cultural learning ability, the capacity to absorb, create and transmit complex information across generations. This was humanity's true superpower, not strength or speed or specialized adaptations, but the ability to learn anything, create anything, adapt to anything through culture rather than evolution. By 10,000 years ago, humans had colonized every continent except Antarctica. They'd adapted to every climate zone on Earth. They'd developed hundreds of distinct cultures and languages, but they remained one species, all carrying the genetic signature of those 1,280 breeding individuals who survived the bottleneck, all descended from the survivors who refused to let extinction win. This diaspora, this explosion of humanity across the planet, wasn't the end of the bottleneck's influence. It was the beginning of humanity's true story. Because now, armed with cultural evolution as their primary adaptation, humans were about to do something no other species in Earth's history had ever accomplished. They were about to stop being subject to their environment and start controlling it instead. So here's the question that keeps evolutionary biologists up at night. Are we still evolving? Or did we really stop 100,000 years ago when that bottleneck locked in our basic body plan? The answer is complicated because it depends entirely on what you mean by evolution. If you're asking whether humans are undergoing the kind of dramatic physical transformations that marked our earlier history, then no. We're not developing bigger brains, we're not growing wings, we're not becoming a different species. The bodies we have right now, the same basic blueprint that emerged from the bottleneck, are essentially the bodies we'll have for the foreseeable future. But if you're asking whether natural selection is still acting on human populations, whether our genes are still changing in response to environmental pressures, then the answer is absolutely yes. We're evolving right now, at this very moment. Just not in the ways you might expect. Take lactose tolerance. For most of human history, no adult could digest milk. After weaning, everyone lost the ability to process lactose, the sugar in milk. This made perfect sense. Why waste energy producing an enzyme you didn't need anymore? But then, around 10,000 years ago, some human populations domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats. Suddenly there was a huge nutritional advantage to being able to drink milk as an adult. Extra calories, extra protein, extra nutrients, especially in environments where other food sources were scarce. In populations that relied heavily on dairy, individuals with genetic mutations that kept lactose production going into adulthood had better nutrition, better health, and more surviving children. Within just a few thousand years, which is incredibly fast in evolutionary terms, lactose tolerance swept through European, some African, and Middle Eastern populations. Today, roughly 35% of people worldwide can digest milk as adults. That's evolution. Recent, rapid, and directly tied to cultural innovations. Or consider high-altitude adaptations. When modern humans first moved into the Tibetan Plateau, probably around 30,000 years ago, they encountered a major problem. At elevations above 13,000 feet, there's about 40% less oxygen in the air than at sea level. Try running on 40% less oxygen and see how well you do. Most people get altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, difficulty thinking clearly. Pregnant women face even worse problems, including higher rates of miscarriage and infant mortality. But Tibetan populations didn't just tough it out. They evolved. Genetic analysis shows that modern Tibetans carry variants of the EPAS1 gene that help their bodies process oxygen more efficiently at high altitudes. These variants probably came from Denisovans, those mysterious human cousins who had already adapted to mountain life. When modern humans and Denisovans interbred, they passed on survival genes that are still helping people live in extreme environments today. Even more remarkably, this adaptation happened fast. Really fast. Some estimates suggest it took as little as 3,000 years for these genetic variants to reach high frequencies in Tibetan populations. That's evolution happening at warp speed, driven by intense selective pressure in a harsh environment. So yes, we're still evolving, but here's the thing. These changes are subtle. They're adaptations to specific local conditions, not major overhauls of the human body plan. Nobody's developing gills, nobody's growing extra limbs. The fundamental architecture that emerged from the bottleneck that's staying put. Why? Because modern humans have developed something that changes everything. Technology. And technology has completely transformed the selective pressures acting on our species. Think about it. For millions of years, human evolution was driven by survival challenges. Can you find food? Can you avoid predators? Can you survive disease? Can you handle climate extremes? Individuals who were better at these things had more surviving children, passing on their advantageous traits. That's how evolution works. But modern humans have essentially hacked the system. You're cold? Build a fire, invent clothing, construct heated buildings. You're hungry? Develop agriculture, create food storage, establish global supply chains. You're sick? Invent medicine, develop vaccines, perform surgery. Every technological innovation reduces a selective pressure. Every time we solve a survival problem with tools instead of genes, we remove a reason for our bodies to change. This doesn't stop evolution entirely, but it definitely slows it down and changes what gets selected for. Consider disease resistance. Throughout most of human history, infectious diseases were the number one killer. Epidemics could wipe out entire populations. Individuals with genetic resistance to specific diseases were far more likely to survive and reproduce. Natural selection was brutal but effective. Then we invented antibiotics, developed vaccines, learned about hygiene and sanitation. Suddenly diseases that had killed billions over human history became manageable. sometimes even eradicated. The selective pressure disappeared almost overnight. We no longer need genetic resistance to smallpox because we eliminated smallpox. We don't need genetic resistance to bacterial infections because we have penicillin. This is why modern medicine is both amazing and evolutionarily strange. We're keeping people alive who would have died in previous generations, including people with genetic conditions that would have been eliminated by natural selection. This isn't bad, it's actually wonderful. But it does mean that harmful genetic variants can persist in the population instead of being selected against. Some scientists worry this could lead to genetic degradation over time. If natural selection isn't removing harmful mutations, they'll just accumulate, potentially weakening the species. But here's the counter-argument: who cares? If we have the technology to treat genetic conditions, does it matter whether the genes persist? A diabetic with access to insulin lives a normal life. Someone with poor eyesight can wear glasses. Modern technology compensates for genetic limitations. We've essentially replaced biological evolution with technological evolution. And technological evolution is vastly faster. It took millions of years for humans to evolve the ability to digest a wider range of foods. It took decades to develop global agriculture that makes almost any food available anywhere. Evolution gave us legs that can run about 15 miles per hour. Technology gave us cars, planes, and spacecraft. But here's where things get really interesting. We're approaching a point where we won't have to wait for evolution at all. We're learning to directly edit the human genome. CRISPR and other gene editing technologies mean we could potentially remove harmful mutations, enhance beneficial traits, even add entirely new capabilities. This raises profound questions. Should we eliminate genetic diseases before children are born? Most people would say yes. Should we enhance intelligence or physical capabilities? The ethics get murkier. Should we add entirely new traits, abilities that no human has ever had? Now we're talking about directed evolution, guided by human decisions rather than natural selection. Some futurists think we'll eventually engineer ourselves into a new species entirely. Humans 2.0, designed rather than evolved. Bodies optimized for space travel, minds enhanced with direct neural interfaces to computers, lifespans extended to centuries. At that point, are we even the same species anymore? Or have we become something new? Others think biological evolution is essentially over for humans, but that cultural and technological evolution will continue accelerating. We won't change our bodies. We'll just keep building better tools, better medicines, better technologies to compensate for biological limitations. In this scenario, humans 10,000 years from now would look exactly like us, but live in a world that would seem like science fiction. The truth is probably somewhere in between. We'll likely see continued minor evolutionary changes in response to changing environments and lifestyles. Populations living in cities might develop different traits than populations in rural areas. Groups exposed to different diets, different climates, different disease environments will continue diverging genetically, at least until global migration mixes everything together. But dramatic physical evolution, the kind that would make future humans unrecognizable? Probably not. Unless something catastrophic happens. Unless we lose our technology and get thrown back into harsh environments where only the strongest survive. Unless we colonize other planets with extreme conditions that demand major adaptations. Here's the fascinating part. We're living in a unique moment in human history. For 99% of our existence as a species, we were subject to the same evolutionary forces as every other organism. Natural selection shaped us generation by generation, adapting our bodies to changing environments. Then, in just the last few thousand years, we developed technologies that essentially freed us from those constraints. We live in bodies designed for the African savanna, but we've used our minds to inhabit every environment on Earth. We have the digestive system of persistence hunters, but we've created agriculture that lets us eat anything. We have the brain capacity of Ice Age survivors, but we've built civilizations that span the planet. This is what makes humans unique. Not that we stopped evolving, but that we found another way to adapt. Faster, more flexible, more powerful than genetic evolution could ever be. We adapt through culture, through technology, through accumulated knowledge passed down and built upon generation after generation. And cultural evolution is accelerating. The pace of technological change is increasing exponentially. Innovations that took thousands of years in the past now happen in decades or years. The smartphone in your pocket contains more computing power than existed in the entire world 50 years ago. Technologies that seemed impossible a generation ago are commonplace now. So do we need to evolve physically anymore? Probably not. Our bodies are good enough, adaptable enough, capable enough to handle whatever challenges we face as long as we have our technology. Our brains, refined by that ancient bottleneck and honed by hundreds of thousands of years of harsh selection, are powerful enough to solve problems faster than evolution ever could. But evolution isn't done with us entirely. It's just changed forms. We're still competing, still adapting, still responding to selective pressures. They're just different pressures than our ancestors faced. Not predators and starvation, but information overload and sedentary lifestyles. Not Ice Age climates, but pollution and climate change. Not infectious diseases, but chronic conditions like diabetes and heart disease. Whether humans will continue to evolve biologically is an open question. What's certain is that we'll continue to change, to adapt, to transform our world and ourselves. Whether that happens through genes or technology or some combination of both, we remain what the bottleneck made us. Survivors, adapters, problem solvers, the descendants of those 1,280 individuals who refused to give up when extinction seemed certain. We carry their genes, their resilience, their determination to survive no matter what the world throws at us. That's not stopping anytime soon. The form might change, but the essence remains. We're still the species that looked at impossible odds and decided to keep fighting. Still the survivors of the bottleneck, still evolving just in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. So here we are, at the end of a journey that took us back nearly 1 million years, to a moment when everything hung in the balance, when humanity was reduced to perhaps 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across a dying landscape, clinging to survival by their fingernails. And here's what that moment did to us. It froze us, not metaphorically, but literally. 100,000 years ago, human physical evolution essentially stopped. That genetic bottleneck compressed our diversity so tightly that our bodies haven't had enough variation to work with since. We're still walking around in Ice Age bodies, still carrying the same basic genetic toolkit that kept those 1,280 survivors alive through the worst climate disaster in our species' history. Think about that for a moment. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, we're basically clones of those bottleneck survivors. Oh, we've got superficial differences, skin color, hair texture, height variations, but genetically, we're almost identical. A human from Norway and a human from Kenya are more similar to each other than two chimpanzees from neighbouring troops in the same forest. That bottleneck made us the least diverse large mammal on the planet, and paradoxically, it also made us the most successful. Because when physical evolution stopped, something else took over: cultural evolution. The survivors of that bottleneck weren't just tough, they were smart, they were cooperative, they were capable of learning, adapting, sharing knowledge across generations. They had to be, because those were the only traits that could save you when the world was ending, and we inherited all of it. Every person alive today carries genes selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. We're all products of the worst that nature could throw at our ancestors. All evidence that sometimes, just sometimes, when everything goes wrong, a few individuals can be tough enough, smart enough, and cooperative enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. But here's the really incredible thing. We didn't win through strength. Neanderthals were stronger. We didn't win through brain size. Neanderthals had larger brains. We didn't win through any physical adaptation. We won through flexibility, through our ability to change our behavior faster than genes could change our bodies. We won through culture, through technology, through the power of accumulated knowledge passed down from generation to generation. And that's still our superpower today. We don't need to evolve thicker fur to survive in cold climates. We invent clothing. We don't need to evolve different digestive systems to eat new foods. We invent cooking. We don't need to evolve wings to fly. We build airplanes. Every challenge that would take nature millions of years to solve through genetic evolution, we solve in decades or centuries through cultural innovation. That frozen moment 100,000 years ago, that genetic bottleneck that stopped our physical evolution, it didn't make us weaker. It made us something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. A species that evolves through ideas instead of genes, through cooperation instead of competition, through culture instead of biology. But the story of the bottleneck also teaches us something important about our future. It reminds us how fragile we really are, how close we came to extinction, how dependent we are on environmental stability and social cooperation. Those 117,000 years when our ancestors lived on the edge of oblivion, they weren't chosen for hardship. They didn't ask for the challenge. They just got unlucky with climate, and they survived through a combination of intelligence, cooperation, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. We're facing our own challenges now. Climate change, environmental degradation, social conflicts that sometimes seem insurmountable. But we carry in our genes the memory of ancestors who survived worse, who held on through 117,000 years of near extinction and came out the other side stronger, smarter, more adaptable than before. We are the descendants of the survivors, the products of the bottleneck, the inheritors of every adaptation, every innovation, every desperate survival strategy that kept humanity alive when death seemed certain. And if they could survive what they faced, if they could maintain hope and cooperation through the worst environmental crisis in human history, then maybe we can face our challenges too. Not through physical evolution. That ship has sailed. Our bodies are frozen in that ice age moment. But through the same cultural evolution, technological innovation, and cooperative problem solving that got us through the bottleneck in the first place. That's our legacy. That's what that frozen moment gave us. Not perfect bodies, but adaptable minds. Not physical strength, but cultural resilience. Not individual superiority, but collective survival. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, wherever you are in the world, you're part of that story. You carry those bottleneck genes. You're connected through unbroken lines of descent to those 1,280 survivors who refused to let humanity die. If you enjoyed this journey through our evolutionary history, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from as you fall asleep. It's amazing to think that bottleneck survivors' descendants are now scattered across the entire planet, all drifting off to sleep under the same stars our ancestors once looked up at, wondering if they'd survive another day. Sleep well. You're the product of 900,000 years of survival against impossible odds. You've got good genes.